Hi, Dennis. Thanks for taking my call again today. I thought we had a very interesting discussion in the first session, but I just want to follow up with what you just said in the first session, where you mentioned a little bit about the core principles of learning and exactly how they work. So maybe you can take me through about the core principles of learning and why exactly are they important?
Okay, Mark, let's make a start on that. Now, when you look at that page, it looks like there's quite a bit of information. There are, in fact, 10 core principles of learning. Now, why there's 10, it wasn't designed that way, trust me.
Okay.
So I've chunked it up so I don't create too much cognitive load, which is something we will touch on. So the basic point of core principles, as we saw in episode 1, is that evidence-based teaching has two main research strands. One is the discovery and the validation that certain teaching methods are more effective than others in terms of student attainment. I mentioned Jeff Petty's work that was landmark in establishing evidence-based teaching, and also the extensive research by John Hattie on the effect sizes of different methods. So what we can say is this, that students learn better when they are given clear learning goals. Now, a learning goal is often referred to as an objective, or learning outcomes, whatever. But it's essentially what the student will know, be able to do at the end of some period of instruction. Now, if the student is very clear in his or her own mind what it is, what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like, and what the expectations are, it helps their learning very significantly. It's a bit like, Mark, having a very good roadmap to get somewhere. Sometimes I look at maps and I think, well, I'm here and I'm there, but it's not terribly clear how I actually get there. So a very good roadmap is like giving students the clear learning goals. They know what they need to do, they know what the standards are, they've got a picture of it in their mind, and they can evaluate their progress in relation to that goal attainment. So that's a very big point. The next one, it really helps if we know what students already know. It's called prior knowledge, activating prior knowledge. For example, you must have been in places where you've sat and listened to a lesson or a talk and you think, I've heard all this before, and that's pretty boring. So the important thing is know what students already know, what the knowledge gaps are, any misconceptions they have, and then address them and connect the new instruction to it. That makes it, one, certainly more efficient and certainly more engaging, because there's no point in pitching it too high, they get lost. If they know it all, it's a total waste of time and we're all wasting our time. So the third core principle is there's so much knowledge and people keep saying knowledge is increasing exponentially. We can't keep putting more and more into the same lesson time. No, we can't. So that's where we've got to be very thoughtful about what we're teaching and teach the key concepts and principles that are actually fundamental to understanding the subject. For example, in these series, I'm trying to focus on the key concepts. What is evidence-based teaching? Yes, it's about what methods to use. Yes, it's about understanding human learning, and it's about how we can combine that knowledge practically to enhance teaching. So this series is focusing on key concepts, and that's what we're doing now, the key concepts and principles of the core principles of learning. Now, good thinking, I'm not going to go into what that is here. I actually have workshops on that, as you know. So this is about providing a good introduction and some illustration of what is evidence-based creative teaching, and people can go beyond this by reading the books or working with us on programs. Now, the next one is that we know a lot about how memory works, and it is really fundamental to learning. A lot of people in education in the past have said, oh, don't get students to memorize stuff. You've got to get them thinking. This is not just nonsense, but it's dangerous nonsense, as we'll see over the next couple of slides.
So that's something I thought was quite interesting, because how in the world do you get somebody to think deeply or critically if they have no frame of reference to anything that they can make reference to? You know where I'm from? So if they memorize it, then how in the world are they supposed to do that deep thinking?
Absolutely, you are so right. It's just, remember educational Jurassic Park that I mentioned?
Yep.
You know, this kind of crazy notion, you can get people who know nothing about something, get them in a room and get them to brainstorm for 2 days and put loads of Post-its on the wall. There's nothing wrong with the methodology, but people don't know nothing about nothing. All they do is just put questions up. Well, that's fair enough, but it doesn't end up with solutions. So that is so right, and we'll see exactly how that works now.
Okay.
Now, we want our students to be critical thinkers. We want them to solve challenging problems. And, you know, that's very much part of where we are today. We've got so many difficult challenges to face. So we want them to think well. But this is the big point, as you said. Lang, I don't normally read quotes out, but students who don't bother to memorize anything will never go much beyond skating over the surface. So if you don't have deep foundational valid knowledge in the field, how can you really do critical thinking? It really is anachronism, I think is the word.
Yeah, we really need to frame this and maybe send it to every educator to remind them, you know, don't get too distracted by the experts who tell you deep critical thinking and memory is bad. Memorizing things are bad.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of research has been done. Tony Wagner, in a book called I think it was The Achievement Gap, he basically says he travels around the world and teachers say, oh, we want our students to think better. But when he asks them, well, what does that entail? They can't actually give him an answer. So and if you don't know what it is, then how can you do it well? So this is a big point with those core principles. Key concepts, get students thinking, analysing, making inferences, interpretation, comparing, contrasting, evaluating. That's just a little summary. Put that together, and that's what builds those neurological networks in the brain. And that is learning at the neurological level, but you've got to do it first at the experiential and the psychological level. So if you can get students thinking well and you engage them with the key concepts, and there's other things that we need to do, that's why there's more than 2 core principles of learning. The result, if successful, builds understanding, and that's what we want to be solidly embedded in students' brains.
Yep.
Now, the next slide. Now, that looks complicated, and when people look at that, they go, wow, that's really complicated. But remember, if we're talking about teaching key concepts, I'm going to simplify it in about 1 or 2 minutes. The only thing that you really need to focus on there is the relationship between working memory, forget about short-term memory, it's not relevant to this conversation, and long-term memory. All information has to pass through working memory. We can't inject it into the brain or download it. We might be able to do that in 20 years, and there is research in this area, but for teachers in the next 5 years, that's probably not going to happen. So you have to provide the instruction so that students engage with it, are able to connect it to their prior knowledge, and are able to do thinking not at a ridiculous pace, because working memory has a limited capacity. Miller talked about 7 plus or minus 2, 5 to 9 bits. In fact, a lot of cognitive scientists now say it's even less than that. The bottom line is students have got to process that information and get it in long-term memory. And that happens at a number of levels, conscious, subconscious, unconscious. We don't need to go into the neurology. All we need to know is that these things have to work together. Now, when it goes into long-term memory, it may not be complete, which means that the student may need to ask a question, or the student might need more reinforcement. But the big point is, when you take stuff out of long-term memory and put it back in working memory, and you check it and you add to it if necessary, when it goes back into long-term memory, it's both better and more solid. So the idea is working with these memory systems, processing in working memory, getting it into long-term memory, checking it, pulling it out, checking it, building on it, putting it back. That's how learning works for everybody. This is nothing to do with learning styles. This is how the brain works. So if you are planning instruction and teaching, using and working with memory systems is really fundamental to help students learn better.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think, and now that when you brought it up and I'm thinking back of my own, when I first started teaching, actually this wasn't made clear to me then. I didn't really think about the limitations of my students' working memory. And it used to, for want of a better word, irritate me that my students weren't able to remember things that I was teaching them. So as you start to share a little bit more about evidence-based teaching and high effect method size and the importance of understanding how the brain works, I'm starting to see the connection and the link.
Yeah, that's great, Mark. I still watch teachers now on a Tuesday afternoon doesn't matter, it could be Wednesday afternoon or Monday, and after lunch, and they spend 45 minutes showing maybe 60 PowerPoint slides and reading them word for word, and they can't understand why the students are disengaged, but they can't possibly process that. The way the brain works is it will typically take in maybe 5 to 9 bits of information, but it will take in more at the beginning and more at the end. There's something called a primacy and recency effect, which we develop further in other programs. And also with novelty, you introduce something that's new and the brain kicks in. It's just the way the brain works. Okay, so that's just a bit of an advanced organizer for something in future. Okay, now we've done our first 5. Hope that they've connected in some way with your long-term memory system, but these ones are quite easy to understand because they're very familiar to us. That if we present information in different modes to engage different senses, visual, auditory and kinesthetic, don't get caught up in learning styles. We are all mainly visual learners. That's part of our evolution. We don't want to focus at all on learning styles because the research shows that it has no positive effect on student attainment. In fact, it can be quite detrimental because if students start thinking, oh, well, I'm a visual learner, which we all are, I don't need to listen to something, it's not my style. But to present information multimodally, different methods, it adds variety to the learning experience. And I'll just chuck in a very quick analogy, Mark. I like, when I was in Singapore, I loved chili crab. And for the first 2 weeks, I had chili crab every night and loved it. But gradually, the chili crab arrived, it was the same, but I'm like, oh, I'm not so sure, as we would say in Singapore, it's not so sure, la. And the bottom line is, I'd habituated to it. So don't, as a teacher, look for a silver bullet. A silver bullet is a kind of, it's in a film where the mythology, where it does indeed, I don't know, I've never met a werewolf, I've met people that look like him, but I've never had a gun because that's illegal and I don't do those kind of things. But the big point is, don't look for one method that works. There are some people who say, oh, problem-based learning, best thing since sliced bread. Yeah, problem-based learning can be an effective method. But you use it all the time, it will suffer from the chili crab syndrome.
That's right.
Now, practice, there's an old saying, practice makes perfect. And the golfer, the great golfer, the young generation might not remember him. Gary Player, he's the boy. And he once said that the more I practice, the luckier I get. Now, yes, practice is important, but equally, if you're not practicing the right thing in the right way, at the right pace, with good feedback, you can get very good at being very bad at something. So there's a difference to say to students, go away and practice. Well, okay, that sounds okay, but you've actually got to give them something called deliberate practice, which again, in other programs we develop further. Assessment, we know it isn't just about grading students, it's about an ongoing process of two-way feedback where you present information in different ways and the students engage in different activities, hopefully talking to you. It's really important to get good rapport, that you can then help them develop their understanding and skills. Okay, one more for this slide, psychological climate. We know what climate means. I'm now in England and we talk about the weather a lot. But when I was in Singapore for 20 years, if you turn around and said, I think it's going to be warm today, you'd probably get taken away by men in white coats, because easiest job in the world, folks, weather forecasting in Singapore, between 25 and 33, possibility of some rain at some stage. Really difficult job. In England, you might as well spin a roulette wheel most of the time. Okay, anything you want to ask me on that?
Yeah, so I just have a quick comment, maybe for you to just elaborate a little bit more. And I noticed the graphic there that says just practice versus deliberate practice. If you could just help me understand, what's the difference, one key difference between just practice and deliberate practice?
Okay, In Singapore, for a number of years, I used to look out the window from the gym that I used. I saw some people playing tennis, and what was interesting, they were equally bad after 3 years as at the beginning. And the thing is, they couldn't hold the racket properly. They didn't realise that when you play tennis, you need to bend your knees and move around.
Sure.
And there are certain techniques of hitting certain strokes. They've never learned that. Now, I often felt like going down and saying, guys, look, you'd enjoy the game more if you did these basic things and practice those, and then get some feedback from me and feedback from the fact that the ball's going over the net and in the lines. So you need to have clear guidance on what skill you're trying to develop. The idea of going out there and trying to be Roger Federer or Serena Williams, it just doesn't happen like that. It's all about where you are now, what's your skill level, right? How can we increase the pace of your serve? How can we put a bit of slice on the ball? How we can put top spin on it? How do you hold the racket? How do you do the posture? So you do it in stages. So you give people a kind of, going back to the core principles, a challenging goal for their skill, but one that's achievable with their effort and your coaching and good feedback.
Okay. Cool. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that.
Okay. The psychological climate bit, sometimes people ask me about that. It's if you go into classrooms, and me and you have trained hundreds, thousands of teaching professionals, and you can go into a classroom and observe a teacher, and you get a feel of it by the climate. If the students are sitting there, they're disengaged before the lecture, you know they're bored, they don't have rapport, they're not terribly happy, and it's not fun. But I've gone into classrooms where as soon as you go in, you see the students smile, there's a bit of fun, there might be a bit of humour, and it feels better. It's like going into, a party. You can go in, there's stony silence, or you can go in and everybody's chatting and having a laugh. And this is one where creativity can come in. How do you build rapport? How do you build the trust so that students work hard, believe they can be successful, and they will be more successful if they know how to learn better? That's really important. And you are able to communicate with them in a manner that's friendly, but specifically supportive to what they're learning. There's no point in saying, oh, that's wonderful. Yes, just keep practicing. That's actually not productive. But yes, give students positive feedback, show some warmth, but it's not about constantly telling them, oh, that's so good, you're so good. It's not about that at all. It's about a good, trusting relationship, focusing on the goals, but having a bit of a laugh, because humour is probably, as De Bono said, Edward De Bono, the most important behaviour of the brain. And we've actually run workshops on using humour in teaching. That's why comedians earn more than teachers. Humour's pretty good. So there you go. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And lastly, and this is a core principle that it's kind of the last one, and in a sense, it's almost a superordinate, an overriding one. And this is where creativity comes in. And this is what we're going to look at in the next episode. What does creativity look like at the very specific level in terms of what we can actually do? It runs through everything else. So remember the routine expert and the adaptive experts. People that are adaptive experts are pretty good with the motivational strategies. And there's a lovely quote there by Vlodkowski. I can actually pronounce his name after several times. Really nice chap, actually. And what he basically says, if something can be learned, it can be learned in a motivational ways. And we want to try to be able to add that bit of creativity. So this is really where some creativity can come in around the motivational strategies, because if you've got a good motivational strategy, it creates a good psychological climate. And if you are using those other core technical principles, the challenging goals, the activating prior knowledge, variation in mode and medium, getting students thinking, deliberate practice and assessment, you are beginning to be a highly effective creative teacher at the level of adaptive expertise. So coming towards a summary, it's important to remember that whilst we talk about these core principles, like you referred to in episode 1, as guiding heuristics? Yes, they are. So whilst we can say that when you're looking at the learning goal, it's focusing on a particular area. When you're looking at prior knowledge, it's a particular kind of instructional strategy and interaction, finding out what they know, checking it, correcting things. But it all works as a dynamic system. So it's a bit like your car. If something's not working very well, it will typically affect other things. And if one small part sometimes can mess the whole system up. So think of this as a dynamic system that you can continually improve. So it's a bit like you might start off with, I better be careful, but a very low end car and progressing eventually to a Maserati. So where you are in terms of this car continuum, creative teachers are, you know, the way they work, they're Maseratis. Okay. Yeah. One last point though is these are universal. They apply wherever you teach, but they must be actually used in relation to the situated context in which you work. And you might be saying, well, what's the situated context?
Exactly.
And it's the last slide. I'll explain the graphic in a minute, but depending on what you're teaching, if you're teaching students to memorize lots of facts, then working with the memory system is really important. And so is testing. Give them constant practice. It's called rehearsal practice. When you talk about using it with skills, it's called sort of deliberate practice, but it's the same basic thing. Give them plenty of it with feedback so that you can build the understanding and the skill set. Obviously, the learner characteristics. If you've got low motivated students, they don't want to be on your course, then motivational strategies becomes almost perhaps the most important thing. And so does the psychological climate. Because if you can't get their attention, as Michelle Pfeiffer found in, I think it was Dangerous, if you can't get their attention, you can't build some level of rapport, then they're not going to pay attention to anything, so we don't have to worry about memory systems. So that's the important thing. Learner preferences has got nothing to do with learner styles. If you find in the afternoon students typically get more tired, then talk to them and say, guys, look, we've got to learn this stuff. Would you, like to see an interactive video, do a case study? How can we give the design of the instructional strategy to students to give them more autonomy and more choice? So if they turn around and say, look, we're really tired today, Chair, by the way, is a Singaporean term for teacher, just to have a little bit of fun here, then there's no point in you showing them loads and loads of slides because they're just not going to buy into it. And the last thing, resource availability. If you don't have sophisticated simulations, whilst it might be a good thing to use for students, if you don't have it, you don't have it. And it's the same with internet connectivity. If the video don't stream, there's not much point in sitting there saying, well, it should stream. And if you could see it, this is what you see. It's pointless. So that's the core principles in a nutshell. Some of the key things about their application. Obviously, in this thing, we can't go into each one in detail, but hopefully it gives you a pretty good idea of what evidence-based teaching is and the component of the cognitive scientific principles that I call, in my book, core principles of learning.
Right. Okay, if we can just, that's right. Okay, so thanks again for taking this call then. It was an interesting one for me. I think this is a bit slightly longer, but I think it was well worth the time because it gives us an idea of purpose of really making use of these principles of learning to really prime us and maybe just to tickle our little gray matter a little bit about thinking of the way in which we need to design our teaching for our students. And I think the next stage or the next episode is where we are now going to talk a little bit more about how we can be creative as teachers, taking into account and putting the core principles into application mode. Is that what we're going to do in the next episode?
Yeah, absolutely. This is quite a meaty episode. And for people watching it, you can always have a break and make a cup of coffee and go back to it. So the idea is you do need to be able to fully understand those core principles, because if you don't understand them, then it's a waste of time. If they're not nicely in your long-term memory system at the level of understanding, it doesn't work. So now it's a question of application, more examples, and you going away and doing this stuff.
That's right. Okay, so thank you very much again for everyone for joining us for this episode. Again, you can contact Dennis at dennis.sale@gmail.com if you decide that you would love to work with us or work with him to see how we can make use of these core principles of learning, or to dive a little bit deeper into some of these principles of learning and how we can actually design learning experiences around it. Or maybe to work with your teachers for their professional development in this area. Please don't hesitate to drop Dennis an email or check out his website at www.dennissale.com. So that brings us to the end of today's episode, and we will see you soon for episode 3. So thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you very much, everyone.